You help us and we'll help you. The head of the National Security Agency asking Congress to give legal immunity to private companies that help it fight cyber attackers. But after what we learned from the NSA surveillance program, should angry customers like you be able to sue those companies if they are wrongfully targeted? Hi, everybody. I'm David Asman. Welcome to Forbes on Fox. Let's go in focus with Steve Forbes, Rick Unger, Rich Carlgard, Elizabeth McDonald, Sabrina Schaeffer, and John Tamny. So, John, should customers like us be able to sue?
Yes, we should, because companies should not be helping the federal government to snoop on us. At some point, we have to ask ourselves how much liberty we're willing to give up in order to create the false illusion of security. To live in a free society, there are risks involved, but we have to remember these risks are worth it to have what we have. Let's not give it up so easily.
And Steve, if I'm buying a service from a company and I don't want them to share that service with the government, shouldn't I be able to sue them if they do that against my will?
David, companies are in an impossible position. If they help out the government, then they're snooping on your privacy. If they don't help out on the government, then they're helping terrorists. So they should have immunity. The focus should be on the government and whether their abuses. Don't bring in companies that are trying to do the best but are caught in an impossible position.
But, Sabrina, the fact is that the government has made some of these companies their partners.
Oh, absolutely. We're taking a giant step toward national socialism if we allow companies to claim immunity. Look, the government doesn't need to own the means of production for us to be in a precarious situation. If industry exists simply at the discretion or for the discretion or the service of government, then we are in a very bad position as a society.
Rich Carlgard, what do you think?
Well, look, I would remind my good friend John Tamny and Sabrina, who are excellent civil libertarians, that the U.S. Constitution is not a suicide pact. Terrorism is real. You know, we did this. The telecoms got immunity during the Bush administration. This is nothing new, and it's needed, and Steve is right. These tech companies are being put in an impossible position.
But, Emac, isn't it time to kind of rethink all this now, now that we know the extent to which some of these programs have gone?
Yeah, I think it is time to rethink it. I agree with John Tamny, and here's why. The government, it stinks because you can't sue the government, right, because the government can claim sovereign immunity. But the way the government is writing the law, it's now there's a bill that's before the Senate, is that if a company passes incorrect information, how do they define, then they can be given immunity from lawsuits. How do you define incorrect information or irrelevant information? Right now, the NSA can store that information up to 5 years, information that you might think is really important. And here's the other problem. India, the Middle East, Asia, we've got countries all around the world putting the onus on companies like Google and Facebook to give over information. Now, how are you going to stop that if you don't if you basically stop lawsuits from stopping those practices?
And Rick, we've talked before about how none of us really like this collusion between the government and the private sector. Isn't suing, giving customers the right to sue these private companies, one of the only ways out?
Well, maybe, but, you know, there's something that everybody, I think, is missing here. It's not just these companies deciding to go along with the government. They are acting pursuant to a FISA court order. They have to do it because they've been ordered by a court to do so. So, you know, that being the case, by the way, I think we're overstating the immunity thing, because I suspect if they are following the order of the court, they're not going to lose a lawsuit anyhow. So what this discussion really does is it dissuades potential plaintiffs.
Okay, you're talking like a lawyer. Let me just focus you here. Are you in favor or not of giving customers a chance to sue companies for misusing information in their eyes?
It's not going to be a very happy answer for you, but in some cases I am in favor because I think it gets abused sometimes, and in some cases I'm not in favor of that.
Okay, John Tamny, I think Rich said the most sort of provocative thing here, which is that you shouldn't be in favor of a suicide of the in protecting our individual rights. That shouldn't allow us to draw the government into being attacked by terrorists. How do you respond to that?
Well, I mean, again, I think when we accept security from the federal government, ultimately we get paralysis. There's no evidence that what they're doing is going to make us safer. We have lots of federal entities telling us that stimulus makes us better off, that QE makes the economy grow and everything. They say that they're making us safer here. Ultimately, I think this is an embarrassment, and I think it sends a message around the world that the champion of liberty is moving in the wrong direction, a very bad step for the United States.
So, Steve, isn't there a danger? Hold on, Steve. Isn't there a danger just sitting back and letting the government decide?
David, one of the functions, legitimate functions of government, is protecting us from external enemies and having internal order. And the Constitution was written by framers who understood that governments that protect you can also abuse you. So take it out on the government. I think Rick hits on something. If a company has in writing a certain order or a certain request, and the statute cited about the government's authority to do it, the company is obliged to do it. If you don't like the law, change the law.
Listen, we all want to catch the bad guys. We want to stop terrorists. Absolutely. But here's the problem. You can't sue the government. You can't stop the government. But companies can stop the government saying, hey, we're getting a ton of lawsuits on our doorstep. And here's the other problem. In India, in India, they're allowing possibly tax officials with access to Google or Facebook data. And they're actually, India is pressuring to have their own government officials on site at places like Research in Motion. Those are really bad precedents.
Well, by the way, Steve, hold on a second, Sabrina. Steve, why do you say the IRS is different?
The IRS is about internal tax collection and about how much money we owe the government and the abuses of the IRS. This is about our security. And again, this is an issue with the government, not with private companies that have to obey the law.
We have focused on how awful these IRS scandals are. But Sabrina, the fact is that even though it's for national security, we are entrusting the same people with our very sensitive information. That kind of gives me the willies.
Of course, it should give you the willies because, first of all, I've seen no evidence yet that all of this big data is keeping us safer. And there's a point at which the haystack gets so big we're not going to find the needle. I think that we don't want to confuse ourselves or fool ourselves that all of this metadata is actually keeping us safer. This is an issue, I agree with John entirely, about civil liberties and our Constitution. But the other half of it is, are we actually safer as a result of this kind of snooping?
Let me throw it back to Rich Cargard then. Return on investment. Is there proof that this is making us safer?
I give the benefit of the doubt to the people who are really in the trenches looking at all the terrorist threats that are coming through. Look, here's another factor. The U.S. is a very litigious society. There's no penalty for initiating a lawsuit, and companies like Google have tens of billions of dollars on their balance sheet. This is just going to be an out-of-control magnet for frivolous lawsuits if people are allowed to sue Google because they're PO'd for some reason.
Yeah, I think that's right, and I think that's why they're bothering this. But look, we have to be a little bit careful here. Sabrina says there's no proof that this has done any good. Well, you can say that if you want to completely disbelieve what the NSA is saying. I'm not telling you you'd be wrong if you want to call them liars, but at the same time, I'm not sure there's not some benefit in thinking, you know what? Listen, maybe it has saved these.
The White House finds it a problem, though.
Steve, let me just ask you, though, if a guy like Snowden, who we discussed in the past, he never graduated from high school, if he can get access to a lot of sensitive information, isn't that a problem? Doesn't that show you how unsecured a lot of this stuff is?
David, that's like saying we have fraud in elections, so let's get rid of elections. You deal with specific problems. You deal with specific abuses. That's what congressional hearings are for. Find out, is this thing working? Isn't it working? What changes do we have to make? But don't put companies in the grinder because of it.
Last point from the boss. Coming up next, lawmakers scrambling to stop subsidized interest rates on student loans from doubling. But some here say a 100% rate hike is exactly what we need. Yes, that's a flip side, and it's coming next. Double trouble. In less than 10 days, the interest rates on student loans may spike from 3.4% to 6.8%. That's when a government subsidy is set to expire. Lawmakers are rushing to strike a deal to keep the subsidy going. But on the flip side, Rich says, let the rates double. Why, Rich?
Well, look, we're looking at $1 trillion of possible student loan defaults, so even 6.8% probably is way too low. College cost a lot. I was able to go to Stanford University, but only after I spent my first 2 years at a community college 3 blocks from my home, and while I lived at home. So I spent nothing my first 2 years and still have a degree from a pretty nice college. There are so many ways today that we can cut the cost of education without asking taxpayers to fund these low-interest loans.
Okay, well, and it is a subsidy. Make no mistake, Rick, and interest rates are based on risk. Student loans have a lot of risk.
Listen, I don't want to get all bleeding heart about this. I obviously very much disagree with Rich. Listen, it's about this to me. If you create a situation where only people who have a lot of money can go to the better schools, and let's face it, the better schools are the most expensive schools. Ivy League schools cost a lot of money. What does it do to this country if only people who can afford it can go to those schools? This has a long-term horrible event. Well, it's not just about working harder to get in.
Steve
You
Forbes,
can get
look,
in,
the
you gotta
fact
pay
is,
for it.
I hate to be personal about it, I got into Columbia in graduate school, but I couldn't afford to go to Columbia, so I went to Northwestern. And I did very well at Northwestern, but I had to make a choice based on how much I could afford. Isn't that natural, Steve?
It is, David, and people have to make these trade-offs. And in terms of Ivies, one of the reasons why, in addition to government subsidies, tuitions are skyrocketing, is institutions feel if Harvard is charging $60,000, by golly, we got to charge $50,000 or $60,000, or people think we're not providing a good education. What do you think, Morgan?
There's an old saying, I'm going to use it here, penny wise, dollar foolish. I think that's what this debate is about, where student loans are concerned. There's two reasons that I don't think we should let interest rates rise. The first reason is we're only talking about subsidized Stafford loans, which are paid for by the government as long as the borrower is in school. So these are essentially, you're raising the rates on taxpayers, more spending by taxpayers. The second reason is because unsubsidized Stafford loans and private loans, this does nothing to affect those. And unsubsidized Stafford loans are already at 6.8% interest rates. It's not making a difference on the colleges people choose.
But Sabrina, we're not talking about pennies here. We're talking about millions and billions of dollars. And as Rich pointed out, you know, the entire student loan problem could lead to trillions of dollars of debt for taxpayers.
Yeah, and it's the entire student loan problem that we're actually talking about here, right? Because it's government intervention that has allowed all of these colleges and universities to drive up their tuition costs to these obscene levels that do push out kids who can't afford them. Look, we have people owe more in student debt these days than they do in credit card debt and in car loans. This is something that's very concerning. The idea that you would enter a job market today when we have a $1 trillion worth of student loan debt, that's sort of unheard of for a country like this.
So, Bill, what Sabrina's saying is that sometimes these government loans, these subsidized government loans, sort of leverage up the price for everybody on what college costs.
Yes, but you don't have to sucker punch the innocent students with a doubling of their interest costs. There's another way to get taxpayers off the hook. It's very simple. You have the colleges guarantee the debts. The colleges would be a lot more careful about burying people with $50,000 graduation debts and a lot more careful about having them exit with not very valuable degrees like anthropology.
Well, that's interesting. Rich, what?
Oh, sorry.
I was anthropology, too.
Oh, dear.
And Rich, you both had student loans.
Rich, what about doing it? What about putting the onus on the colleges rather than the taxpayers?
Yeah, I think that's probably a pretty good idea. As always, Bill finds a bank shot to make a good argument. But I think, you know, again, I would go back to the point with online opportunities and the underused community college resources in this country. There are so many ways that people can bring down costs and still have a first-class education, and that's where we should be looking.
Morgan, you want to get in? Go ahead.
The Senate Republicans proposed something earlier this month, and I'm all for it, and that's tying interest rates to the treasuries, which we do with all of our other types of loan interest rates. I say we do that instead.
That was actually Liz Warren. But the problem with that, Steve, is that as we mentioned before, and as Rich mentioned, these are risky loans. Very often for these student loans, you don't have to give a credit history like you do for other loans. That's why they're so risky.
Yeah, and this is why I think Sabrina's right. We've got to see this as a whole thing and not just the specific issue of interest rates. The government is driving up college costs, which has kids leaving school like peonage, servants who are working for the government for 10 or 20 years instead of going out and having a great career. They start with a mortgage without a house.
I got to point this out, though, you know, because I think it gives total proof to my argument. We got two people sitting here, both very successful, both very smart, both anthropology majors, and both of whom had student loans.
And now, guess what, Rick? Whoa, wait a minute, Rick. Guess what? I had to go to the cheaper school. I made a decision to go to the cheaper school, and I ended up doing pretty well, right?
Yes, you did, but you had to get a student loan to do it.
And as Rich pointed out, he spent 2 years in a community college, and therefore he got the good education and didn't spend an extra $50,000 or $100,000.
Yeah, but David's more successful than Rich.
And there's an
That is a subject for another debate. And frankly, I think Rich would win that debate. All right, coming up.